Hello there. This is CRP speaking to you live today, Thursday, October 28th, 2021. The weekly webinar is usually on Sunday, but this is a makeup weekly webinar because of the recent illness that I had, that I was out for a couple of weeks. And so today, Thursday, I'm going to be doing this webinar discussing Winston Churchill. And next Sunday, there'll be the regularly scheduled weekly webinar. And then next Thursday, I'll be delivering the second makeup webinar. And that way we'll be on point once again. So yeah, I'm looking at the chat and it looks like everybody can hear me pretty well. So just give me a +1 anyway, just to, just to confirm. But I'm going to be discussing Winston Churchill. Yeah. Now, most of us know the mythology of World War II. Most of us know that World War II was, in a very weird sense, sort of like the founding myth of our current regime. Now, you, just like I did, probably grew up with all the stories of World War II about how evil Hitler was, about the underhanded Japanese who attacked Pearl Harbor for no reason whatsoever, how Hitler just decided to exterminate a whole bunch of people just because he was an evil bastard, and that there are certain people who were just glorious wartime leaders, like Winston Churchill, like Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Sometimes people say that Stalin was also a great wartime leader, and other times they're like, ooh, if they happen to know a little bit more about history, they realize that putting Stalin up on a pedestal is a very dangerous business, because the guy was an evil bastard. I mean, a truly evil bastard. And so Stalin is sort of like not mentioned, but FDR and Churchill especially, they are lionized, I mean, Churchill himself is called the Great Lion. Mhm. And his bulldog face has been, seen in countless portraits. There's that famous portrait by Yusuf Karsh of him sitting there looking very bulldog and very menacing and very determined. And you look at him and you say, oh, that's a great wartime leader. That's a great man. That's a great leader who led his people to victory. Well, not quite. I'm going to be discussing Winston Churchill here, and I'm going to start first with the myth, with what everybody says about him. And of course, I'm also going to add the things that he actually did. He was a very industrious man, a man filled with energy, a man who was a remarkably good public speaker and writer. But as you get to know him, you realize that he was not a saint. He wasn't even a great wartime leader. On the contrary, I have come to the conclusion that he destroyed the British Empire and ruined his people because of his lust for war. That's what I have come to conclude. And I'm going to show you what I think and why, and the examples and the evidence that I think gives me a strong ground to stand on insofar as my assessment of the man. Okay? Okay, so let's get started. You guys don't need to see my ugly mug, so let me just put the slideshow on and let's get cracking. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to start off with are some quotes from the man himself. These are the actual quotes. The first one is actually apocryphal. History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it. That's always been ascribed to Winston Churchill. The actual quote is not so elegant. It's, I consider that it will be found much better by all parties to leave the past to history, especially as I propose to write that history. He wrote that, or said that, in 1948, which is close enough to history will be kind to me, for I intend to write it. And he did, by the way. He wrote a very large book called The History of the Second World War. And of course, in that history, which earned him the Nobel Prize in Literature, he portrayed himself as a great man of destiny who led his people through war. I mean, he was the hero of his own book. So, okay, fair enough. But the second quote which he said in 1898 when he was 24 years old, I think is extremely indicative of the man, and it's something that you should read carefully. I'll read it for you. I do not care so much for the principles I advocate as for the impression which my words produce and the reputation they give me. Now, this was said by a 24-year-old man, and it's fairly callow, even for a young man of 24, but listen to the words. Let me repeat them for you. I do not care so much for the principles I advocate as for the impression which my words produce and the reputation they give me. In other words, he's saying that he doesn't really give a shit about the principles he's espousing. All he cares about is that his words, whatsoever those words may be, produce in others a positive impression of him and give him more power and prestige. That's pretty fucking cold-blooded, if you ask me now, isn't it? I mean, the first line, it's, amusing, the apocryphal version. The second line, the actual line, what he actually said, is especially as I propose to write that history. He's basically saying that he's going to say anything necessary to get his way to make himself look good. And this is very interesting. Okay, so let's get started. So the myth. Now, the first thing, and this is indisputable, that Winston Churchill was a great orator and a great writer. I mean, he really was. He had the ability to think on his feet very quickly, and he was extremely good at debating and at coming up with the great line. There are all kinds of great lines that he said during the Second World War. We will fight on the beaches, we will fight in the air, we will fight in the sea, blah, blah. The lines, his oratorial skill are unmatched. And this is indisputable. From a young age, he distinguished himself as an incredible orator and an incredible writer. He was an indifferent student growing up, but he was exceptionally good at military history and at English. He was a great writer and a great orator, and he worked at it, by the way. He practiced it, no different from Adolf Hitler. Those famous pictures of Adolf Hitler posing and making different poses and photographing himself to see the effects that they would have. Yeah, like anything, he practiced at it. I'm talking about both Hitler and Churchill, and they were very good at oration. Hitler, in terms of writing, he was extremely good. Mein Kampf is very compelling. Mm-hmm. And it would have been extremely compelling to the people that he wrote it for back in the 1920s. That was the only book that Adolf Hitler wrote, but all of his speeches were by him. And insofar as Winston Churchill is concerned, Churchill was an exceptionally gifted orator. You have to understand that. And there was something else, too, about him. He had enormous energy and enormous personal charisma. That is, people who came within his orbit, within his physical presence, they were struck from an early age with his personal magnetism and his energy. And many say that the magnetism came from the fact that he was so energetic. Okay. The myth goes on to say that he was a great war leader who alone, among everybody, saw the evils of Nazism, that he was sort of like some savant who alone saw the dangers and peril of Hitler and the Nazis. That's the myth. The other great myth is that he was the great liberator of Europe and of the colonized people of the British Empire, that he was the one who freed everybody from Nazism and liberated the colonies. Later on, that myth was sort of like thrown overboard because he really wasn't a liberator, of the British Empire. On the contrary, he wanted to continue the British Empire. But while he was alive, at least, that was the myth that he created for himself. And it's a myth that has had a great deal of staying power. Now, to get out of the way, the personal bits about him. He was born in, oops, I said 1974. Of course not. He was born in 1874. My mistake there. Sorry about that. He was born in 1874 to Lord Randolph Churchill, who was a direct descendant of the first Lord Duke of Marlborough, and the American heiress Jenny Jerome. Now, this is significant. See, at this time in the 19th century, especially right after the Civil War, there was this wave of American heiresses, women, young women, who came from families with a great deal of money. And they married British aristocrats who didn't have any money at all, who didn't have a pot to piss in, quite frankly. Lord Randolph Churchill was one of these people. See? Because during the 19th century, the British aristocracy had lost its financial preeminence. Because you have to understand, before the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain, landed aristocrats had the money. And they got the money from the fact that they owned all this property that was farmed. See? It was a semi-feudal society in many ways. I mean, the people, the workers there in the farms were free to go wherever they wanted to. But the money went to the landed aristocracy. And that's why the landed aristocracy was able to afford those big country houses and so forth, because they had all this land around it that supported that lifestyle. And remember, too, labor was far cheaper before the Industrial Revolution. And so it was easy to have a great house staffed with 30, 40, 50 people looking after every nook and cranny. And the expense of it was relatively mild or minor for these landed aristocrats. It was during the Industrial Revolution where the cities absorbed all the workforce from the country. And so many people went to the cities to work at the factories and earn more money. Earn more money that they could send back home to the country. And eventually, everybody wound up moving to the cities. And so staffing these great houses became much more expensive. And of course, it was just harder to make a living for these landed aristocrats. And Lord Randolph Churchill, here in the late 19th century, is a typical example. An aristocrat without any money. And so he married Jenny Jerome. Now, Jenny Jerome, her background has always been a little bit in dispute, because she's supposed to have been the daughter of what's his name here? I do believe it was I can't seem to find it. I think it was Isaac Isaac Jerome. No. It was something else Jerome. It doesn't really matter. He was called at the time the King of Wall Street. He was a financier. Now, the controversy arises that people say that he was of Scottish descent. Scottish descent, and that the first Jeromes had arrived in the United States in 1717. The first one was called Timothy Jerome. But there is some dispute as to whether he was actually Jewish. And in fact, there's some writers in Israel who claim that the Jerome family was actually Jacobson and that they were German Jews. This is obscure. And quite frankly, there are people on both sides of this particular argument that want to make sure that the other side, is sort of like stifled. And so it's unclear, quite frankly. It wouldn't be surprising. It would not be surprising at all. Considering the background of Jenny Jerome's family, they were involved in Wall Street, and they were also involved in entertainment businesses that have been traditionally Jewish. And so it could be that. I mean, it's obscure, but I'm just putting it out there. There is some obscurity as to Winston Churchill's mother's family. Lord Randolph Churchill, it's very clear that he was who he claimed to be. There's also an issue that Jenny Jerome's other child, because she had two, Winston and John, I believe, and there's some controversy as to whether the child was actually Randolph Churchill's child. The fact is that the marriage was a quite unhappy one, and they eventually divorced because it was a marriage of convenience. She wanted a title, and he wanted her money. That was the bargain that was struck, and such marriages rarely work. Mhm. Now, Winston Churchill himself would marry Clementine Hosier, a British woman. He married her in 1908 when he was 34. He had one son and four daughters with her. The marriage seems to have been rather unhappy because he devoted all of his time to his political career, and they did not see each other that much. There have been a lot of TV shows and movies that portray them as a very loving and happy couple, but that's a lie. And they were married for 57 years. During the 1930s, Winston Churchill had an affair with some other woman, but in general, he was not particularly interested in women. I'm not saying that he was gay. I'm saying that he was just uninterested in women and much more interested in pursuing his political career. The fact that before he married Clementine Hosier, there's no real story of him pursuing women and whatnot, sort of like it gives credence to the notion that he just did not care about women, full stop. Mhm. And as I'll explain, the affair that he seems to have had in the 1930s was probably a result of a depression because his political career was at a complete standstill. It was what he called later his wilderness years, and so it could have been that. But he clearly had no interest in family life. He did not really care about his wife or his children. His children have all said in different opportunities that he was a distant, indifferent father to them. And that one or another just doesn't mean anything, but I'm just putting it there. Now, here are the career highlights of Winston Churchill. This is more or less what he did with his life. He was born, as I said, in 1874, and in 1898, he went to South Africa. He had been a journalist up to that point and an adventurer. He's traveled here and there and whatnot. And he went to South Africa because he anticipated the Boer War. And he went there essentially as a gentleman soldier. He actually had gone to military school. He went to Sandhurst. And but then he had resigned his commission. He had been a journalist, an adventurer. He went to South Africa and joined in the Boer War. And his stint there was very controversial. I'll get to it in just a moment. Then he was back in UK by 1900, and he got a seat in Parliament in 1900 based on the strength of his accounts of the South African War. As I said, he was personally very magnetic and a very good writer. When he came back from South Africa, he wrote an account of his adventures there, which became a bestseller. And he was, like I said, a very successful writer. And on the strength of his writing and his successful writing career, and on the strength of his personality, he was elected in 1900 at the age of 26 as a Minister of Parliament. And he would serve from 1900 until 1964, excepting a period of a little over 2 years between 1922 and 1924, which are actually important. I want you to keep them in mind. I'll get to them in just a moment. He was Home Secretary between 1910 and 1911. Home Secretary is basically like the Secretary of State, for those of you who are American. It looks after the UK. It's the minister in charge of what's going on domestically in the United Kingdom. He was later First Lord of the Admiralty. Now, this is a key position. It doesn't exist in any other navy or military in the world. The First Lord of the Admiralty is, for all intents and purposes, the most important commander of British forces, because the British Navy has always been the source of its great power. After all, it's an island. He was First Lord of the Admiralty from 1911 to 1915. And during that period of time, he would supervise the British Navy as the Germans competed with the British Navy, and until the start of the First World War in 1914. Now, he actually served as an officer at the front, on the Western Front, between 1915 and 1916. He resigned from the from the position of First Lord of the Admiralty because of political issues that were going on at the time. The Conservatives in the Unity cabinet flatly refused to have him serve as First Lord of the Admiralty. And that's why he had to resign. And I'll get to the issue of his relationship with the Conservative Party in just a bit. He served, like I said, from 1915 to 1916, but for all intents and purposes, it was a trivial service. He didn't really contribute anything. Mm-hmm. He was Chancellor of the Exchequer between 1924 and 1929, mm-hmm. A little over 5 years. And these were crucial years. I mean, truly crucial. Mm-hmm. Excuse me, a little under 5 years. It was 4 years and 8 months or something like that. And he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. Chancellor of the Exchequer is, for those of you who are not British, it's basically Secretary of the Treasury. It's the cabinet officer who delivers the government's budget, who formulates the government's budget and delivers it to Parliament for a vote. Mm-hmm. Then from 1929 to 1939, are what are known as the wilderness years, because he was fired as Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1929, directly because of policies that he implemented as Chancellor of the Exchequer. His policies directly led to the British Great Depression, because in the United States, the Great Depression started roughly in 1929, but in the United Kingdom, it actually started in 1924, precisely because of policies that Winston Churchill implemented in 1924, specifically going back on the gold standard. And I'll get to that in just a moment. He was in the wilderness from 1929 to 1939. And in 1937, he saw his chance to get back into power. Because why was he in the wilderness? Well, because he'd flip-flopped from party to party. He'd started off as a conservative in 1900. And in 1904, he had changed parties to the Liberals, because he saw his opportunity to be a part of the cabinet of a Liberal government, which happened. He became Home Secretary in 1910 under a Liberal government. But then in 1922, he lost his seat as a Liberal, and he was out of the House of Commons from 1922 until 1924, when he turned again and left the Liberal Party and rejoined the Conservative Party for the landslide Conservative victory of 1924. Mm-hmm. And so what happened was that, he was able to become Chancellor of the Exchequer during the Conservative government in 1924, until he was finally just booted out because of sheer incompetence of how he handled the economy. And between 1929 and 1939, he held on to his seat in Parliament, but he was a backbencher. A backbencher, for those of you who don't know parliamentary lingo, is a member of Parliament who sits in the back bench, i.e., he doesn't have any cabinet portfolio and is not considered particularly important or influential. Now, he was in this wilderness for 10 years, but it was around, and constantly throughout this period, he was struggling to break out, to get back into the cabinet, to get back with a big job. And he kept failing because both the Liberals and the Conservatives distrusted him. And the Labour Party was slowly beginning to grow, and they certainly despised him because they saw him as an upper-class toff. The Conservatives saw him as a traitor to his class. The Liberals saw him as an individual who would say anything to get ahead. Nobody trusted him, because the appreciation was that he would say anything to anybody to get ahead. That was the reputation he had. That's why between 1929 and 1939, he was nowhere. And it was in 1937 that he lit on the idea of being against appeasement to Hitler. He was the person who came up with the notion that negotiating with Hitler was appeasement. And it's very important that you remember this. He grabbed on to the notion of appeasement as a criticism of the Chamberlain government, and he ran with it. For 2 years, from 1937 to 1939, when the Chamberlain government finally brought him back in as First Lord of the Admiralty, he was relentless in saying that any kind of negotiation with Adolf Hitler was appeasement. Appeasement, of course, having the connotation of weakness, having the connotation that you are being weak to a bully, and eventually the bully is going to demand more, and eventually you're going to have a fight with the bully. That was the notion of the word appeasement. And Churchill was relentless in his speeches in the House of Commons, criticizing the government, the cabinet officials, relentlessly going after Hitler and the Germans. Do keep in mind that he was distrusted by all. And so the only way he could get some kind of foothold was by latching on to the notion of appeasement and using it to get public sentiment on his side, even if it was, not accurate. Okay. Now, in 1939, finally, in early September of 1939, the British government declared war on Hitler and Nazi Germany. And it was over the issue of Poland. Now, one of the key people who pushed for this, of course, was Churchill. He insisted on it, that war be declared on Germany because of the German and Soviet invasion of Poland. This is very important. See, in September of 1939, the Germans invaded Western Poland. But because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviets invaded the eastern half of Poland. Now, Winston Churchill had always been anti-socialist, anti-communist, anti-Soviet Union. But he said nothing about the Soviets invading the eastern half of Poland. He didn't say a thing. And he saw to it that the war was declared on Nazi Germany, but not on the Soviet Union, even though he had been an avowed anti-communist for decades. In fact, he had praised Mussolini to his face when he had visited Mussolini in 1927. He praised Mussolini for being anti-communist. So Churchill doesn't have a problem with fascism, because fascism today has certain connotations, moral connotations, but at the time, those connotations did not exist. In 1927 and in the 30s, fascism was just merely another ideology. Communism was looked down upon much more than fascism, because communism had actually done horrifying things against the people of Ukraine, against the people of Russia. There was more moral weight, more negative moral weight against communism than against fascism in the 1930s. And yet Churchill saw to it that war was declared against Germany for the invasion of Poland, but not the Soviet Union, which also invaded Poland at the same time. Okay, so he was First Lord of the Admiralty. It was really a brief appointment. It was really from September of 39 until May of 1940, when he was named Prime Minister. In a cabinet reshuffle, and Chamberlain realized that he had lost confidence in his cabinet, and so he resigned and put forward Winston Churchill. And then, of course, Winston Churchill would later on just completely smear and throw Chamberlain under the bus, in a contemporary phrase. And so anyway, he was prime minister from 1940 until 1945, when he was booted out of office after apparently successfully winning the war. The great wartime leader was booted out of office at the first chance that the people could get. So they booted him out in 45. And from 45 to 51, he was, a minister of parliament, and he gave a lot of speeches. And one of those speeches in March of 46 was the so-called Iron Curtain speech. He famously said how an iron curtain had descended around Eastern Europe. Of course, he didn't mention the fact that he had been instrumental in his negotiations with Stalin for giving up Eastern Europe to the grips of the Soviets. I'll get to that in just a moment. Anyway, he had a second prime ministry from 1951 to 1955. At this time, he was an older man. I mean, when he went into office in 51, he was 77 years old, roughly the age of Joe Biden is today. And by the time he exited office in 55, he was, quite frankly, a decrepit old man. I don't mean this in a cruel way. It's just a fact of life. We all, once we get up there in our years, no matter how energetic and strong we might have been, the body is just unwilling. And he was a decrepit older gentleman by 55, and he died in 64, I believe. And that's basically the career highlights of his. Now, that's the myth. The myth of him being a great man, a great wartime leader who led his people to victory in World War II. That's the whole of his reputation. In the period between 1945 and 1951, he wrote his History of the Second World War, where, like I said in the initial quotes, he wrote up and glorified his own role in the Second World War and created the perspective that most of us have about the Second World War and about Churchill. There was a recent movie starring Gary Oldman as Winston Churchill called Our Finest Hour, or Their Finest Hour, something like that. The Finest Hour, glorifying Churchill. That movie is the typical propaganda about Churchill, that he was just this great man. But he wasn't. And one of the things that people understood about him from a very early age, almost at the beginning, that for all his gifts of energy, his oratorial skills, his writing skills, he was a man of horrible judgment. And it was something that was noted early on. And the thing that when you read about it, okay, that you can't quite fathom some of the decisions that he made that were so stupid. And they weren't even about ego. They were just stupid decisions. And I think for me, the best example of this horrible judgment is the so-called armored train incident in the Boer War. Briefly, Winston Churchill went to South Africa because he anticipated the Boer War. The Boer War was the war between the British occupation forces and the native Boers. Boers were the farmers. They were the white farmers who were descended from Dutch. In fact, they spoke a version of Dutch, and they considered themselves Dutch, and they didn't like the fact that South Africa had been conquered from the Dutch, and South Africa was being administered by the British, and the British had onerous conditions on the Boers. It doesn't really matter at this point, but the point that happened was that at one point, Churchill convinced the military commander that they should go on an armored train into Boer country and attack the Boers. Now, this is 1898. Now, the steam engine, the trains had been around for 80 years, okay? People understood trains very, very well. And there had already been a very, very famous mechanized war, the American Civil War. The American Civil War is extraordinarily important because it was the first time mechanized warfare was applied. Insofar as industrial warfare, okay, where it wasn't just like a musket that had to be refit, or spears or swords or some shit like that. You had actual repeating firearms. And the use of trains for logistics and supplies was very clearly understood. Tanks were still about 15 years away from being invented. But the train and its uses and weaknesses were very clearly understood. Now, this idiot, Churchill, who at the time was 24, but still a fucking idiot, he convinced the military commander on the strength of Churchill's being upper class, on the strength of him having gone to Sandhurst and some other issues, he convinced the military commander that they should armor a train and ride that train to attack the Boer forces. What do you think happens? See, a train goes on tracks, of course, and tracks are very fragile. Mhm. And so what happened? The obvious happened. See, this armored train that was accompanied by horse troopers on horseback, but not that many. Basically, an escort, not an actual force that could be reckoned with. Well, this armored train went north into Boer country, and de Klerk and his men, what did they do? They blew up the train tracks, and the train was stuck, and then they blew up the train tracks behind it, and then just shot the fuck out of them. Mhm. Yeah, they barely escaped with their lives. In fact, Churchill was captured. Uh, he was captured and subsequently escaped, and it was all very adventurous and glamorous, right? But it was a complete disaster. And anyone with just a little bit of common sense would have realized that having an armored train be your attack force was a recipe for disaster. I mean, you don't have to have gone to the best military school in the world, as Churchill had, to realize that this was a horrible decision. It was a harebrained scheme of remarkable stupidity. And yet, this harebrained scheme, well, he, because of his oratorial skill and the strength of his personality, he convinced the British military commander to do this, and his forces were cut to pieces. Mhm. And to me, I have to emphasize that this single incident shows bad judgment on a colossal scale, on an absolutely colossal scale, because what it says is that, see, Winston Churchill had this fixed idea in his head that this armored train would be the salvation of all. Mhm. It's silver bullet thinking, and an inability to get out of your mental hole and just keep on digging deeper into your mental hole. You will see this throughout Winston Churchill's career, where he has this fixed idea and no evidence will make him change his mind, no matter how grotesque and obvious the evidence. He will continue on his path. Now, this in many ways is an admirable quality, but insofar as leadership is concerned, it's catastrophic. See? Because at the end of the day, leadership is not about winning for yourself. It's not even about winning wars. It's about growing your people, protecting your people, ensuring their future, ensuring their position over time. That's the notion of leadership. And Winston Churchill would never show this. On the contrary, he would become fixed on certain ideas and throw it all on certain fixed ideas, irrespective of the evidence. And he would refuse to change his mind. And on top of that, his ideas were fundamentally stupid. The armored train incident is a classic example. Then the Dardanelles campaign. This was in Turkey during the First World War. He was First Lord of the Admiralty, and it's the reason that he lost the position. Because what happened was that during 1911, he had joined the Edward Grey faction in the government that had been secretly preparing for war with Germany. Because the British, over the centuries, really, had this balanced power diplomatic approach to continental Europe. And it was very simple. What they would do is that they would always ally themselves with the weaker party in Europe, because they always thought that there ought to be a balance of power in Europe. And so if, for instance, one country became powerful, say, for the sake of argument, Germany, then the British would ally themselves with the French in order to balance out the German power. Now, this approach led to certain blindnesses that aren't important, but these blindnesses were very stereotypical of the British approach to Europe during the 19th century and into the 20th century. And it's the reason that the British went to war in the First World War when there was no real need for them. because they didn't want to see an ascendant Germany. Now, Germany was ascendant because of virtue of its population and its industrial development. It was inevitable that it was going to be the premier inter pares insofar as powers of Europe. It was inevitable that the Germans would overrun the French. I mean, they did overrun the French, literally, in the War of 18, when was it, 1879? When Bismarck, rolled over the French, it was inevitable. Germany was a larger country, more people, more territory. Okay. And it was inevitable. Mhm. And the problem, of course, with Germany was then so many ethnic Germans were spread out across Eastern Europe, not Western Europe, Eastern Europe. That was always the problem. Okay. And it's going to matter in just a little bit when I talk about the Second World War. But anyway, the British had always had this notion of the balance of power. Now, Edward Grey was an actual architect of the First World War. Winston Churchill was a cheerleader of the First World War. In 1914, he was a 40-year-old man, First Lord of the Admiralty, and he came up with this idea that in order to win the war, the Allies had to, quote, strike at the soft underbelly of the Axis powers. And that meant attacking Turkey. And there's a famous movie called Gallipoli that shows the complete and colossal waste of youth. Gallipoli is a great defeat that still traumatizes the Australians and New Zealanders because so many of them died needlessly. The flower of the country died in that war, died in that attack, rather. The Dardanelles campaign, because they attacked Turkey, and Turkey was ready for them. Turkey wiped them out, okay? Because it wasn't attacking the soft underbelly. It was attacking the backyard of the Turks. And the notion had been like this fixed idea, and Churchill pushed it. And he was able, through very careful politicking after this disastrous campaign, to elude responsibility. He actually controlled the committee that looked into the Dardanelles disaster in 1916. He was very good friends with many of the members of those committees. And that's how he was able to elude responsibility for a campaign that he had masterminded and he had pushed and he had said would guarantee a quick end to the war. Now, you look at a map of Europe, the war is static. We have these trenches being fought across Belgium and France between the German forces and the Allied forces, French and British. Now, how exactly is an attack on the Anatolia Peninsula going to change that? The short answer is it's not. It was a stupid idea. It was a fixed idea that Churchill had that caused all this loss of life pointlessly. Nothing was won. Treasure and men was just thrown away. It was traumatic for all involved, and nothing was won. And that's the Dardanelles campaign. And that's when intelligent people in the United Kingdom realized that Churchill was a man without any kind of judgment. No judgment whatsoever. He was a great talker, but he did not have any kind of judgment whatsoever. That was the nail in his coffin insofar as his reputation. Now, he would go on to do other things that are, equally just stupid. For instance, he forced Jewish migration to Palestine. The Palestinians, the natives there, who had been there for, 1,700 years, they did not want the Zionists to invade their land. I mean, all this bullshit that Israel belongs to the Jewish people, it doesn't. It's Palestinian land. And it had been Palestinian land for 1,700 years. Now, the Jews, Jerusalem is a very important city for them, the Temple of Solomon and all that stuff. But, so sorry, they lost out on it. 1,700 years ago, they were expelled by the Romans and they were forced out into the diaspora. But Zionists had this idea that Palestine was the promised land for them. And it was Winston Churchill who forced the Jewish migration to Palestine. Because remember, Palestine was a British protectorate after the Second World War in the partition of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire had no sympathy whatsoever for the notion of European Jews and Sephardic Jews moving to Palestine and colonizing it. They had no interest in that. Of course not. It would just cause problems for them. And they weren't stupid. It would cause problems. The Palestinians who lived there would be up in arms. And all of a sudden, you had this radical communist group of Jews setting up shop in your own backyard. It's fucking insane. So, of course, the Ottoman Empire had nixed that idea. And the Zionists, rather, were just spinning their wheels until Winston Churchill forced the issue because he had been lobbied in England by Jewish interests and Zionist interests into allowing the Jews, the Zionists, to set up their kibbutzes and other kinds of collectives. Remember, a kibbutz is a collective. It's a communist collective. The Zionists were communists. Never forget that. And Churchill had proclaimed himself to be anti-communist for years. I mean, since at least 1904. And certainly after the Bolshevik Revolution and the Russian Civil War, he was virulently anti-communist. He knew that the Zionists were communists and they were practicing communists. That's the whole point of the kibbutzes. It's a communist enclave. That's what it is. And yet he forwent his principles and pushed aside the Palestinian objections and imposed the Zionists on Palestine. And the problems we have today are a direct result of that. The state of Israel exists because of Winston Churchill. Had he not pushed for the Zionists to be allowed into what is today Israel, there would have been no Israel. There would have been no Zionist colonization. The Palestinians would still be there, and it would probably be a hell of a lot more peaceful, quite frankly. But spilt milk, water under the bridge. But that's another example of bad judgment. Now, another one, a colossal one, was 1924. He was named Chancellor of the Exchequer. Now, do keep in mind that at this time, in the early 1920s, being Chancellor of the Exchequer, it did not have quite the power that it has today. It was more like a position of reconciliation of the different interests of the government insofar as budgeting is concerned. It was, all the different ministers would thrash out the priorities in terms of using resources, and the chancellor would basically write it up and create the budget, but it was based on the political infighting within the cabinet. The War Department wanted more money, or this department wanted more money, and so forth. But he implemented one of the most catastrophic decisions, which was the return to the gold standard. Now, why does this matter? Well, when you have a hard currency does not inflate, okay? And you think that would be a good thing. Well, contraire. See, if you have a hard currency, your goods and services are more expensive for foreign buyers, so they don't buy them, of course. Now, it wasn't just that he went back to the gold standard, okay? That was bad enough. But he pegged the pound to gold at the 1914 rate. Now, during the First World War, there had been huge expenses and whatnot, and the British Treasury had been severely depleted. By pegging the pound to the price of gold back in 1914, Churchill created the conditions, and by the way, this was all predicted, and it was shouted from the rooftops by a lot of economists, including John Maynard Keynes. What would happen would be a rapid depletion of the remaining gold in the British Treasury, and eventually the pound would break. It would not be able to take the withdrawals of gold. And on top of that, it would price all of British goods and services out of the market, which is exactly what happened. A lot of people talk about well, I'll talk about the German economy in just a minute. But the point is, see, between 1924 and 1929, as a direct result of his policies as Chancellor of the Exchequer, Winston Churchill created the Depression in the UK. The Depression worldwide really started with Austrian banks that defaulted around 1921, 23, something like that. I forget. But this wave of defaults and deflationary pressures, which is what a depression is, where prices fall, and it sounds great that prices are falling. No, but what happens is that when prices fall, factories lay off workers because they are not getting the income necessary to pay for the workers. And so if the workers are out of a job, they don't have the money, obviously, to buy things. And since they don't have the money to buy things, the companies that remain, the firms that remain, the little shops that remain, they are selling less and less, and therefore they start to either fire workers or close outright, creating even more unemployment. You see, that's the problem of deflation. A lot of people think that, oh, deflation is great. You know, my money is worth more tomorrow than it is today. Well, yeah, sure. If you have cash, it's great for you. But most people, they work for a living. And so when you have deflation, then, you know, the whole economy goes tits up. It's called a deflationary spiral. And it's a nightmare for all economists. No economist wants it because inflation, problematic as it is, and we're seeing that now, well, there are solutions to it. But for a deflationary spiral, it's just a black hole going down. And Churchill was told beforehand by multiple people that going back to the gold standard, and especially pegging it to the price of 1914, would break the British economy, and it did. It created huge unemployment, and he was kicked out of office in 29. And here's the thing. See, he at this point he had lost all credibility. I'm skipping ahead here a little bit. Well, I'll wait for it. It's just the next section. So hang on. So he got kicked out as Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1929 as a direct result of his policies, which were just created all kinds of problems to the British economy. And then he was in the wilderness, as he said, between 1929 and 1939. During this period, he was the lone named politician who defended Edward VIII in the abdication crisis of 1936. Now, this is another example of colossally bad judgment. See? Now, for those of you who don't know, Edward VII died in 1936, and Edward VIII became the king, and as the Prince of Wales, as the oldest son. Now, he was a bachelor, and he was having an affair with an American married woman called Wallis Simpson. Now, Wallis Simpson was a gold digger. It's simple as that. You don't have to, pretty it up. She was just a gold digger, and apparently a very, very compliant mistress. And Edward VIII lost his mind over this woman. Mm-hmm. I mean, instead of doing the sensible thing, which is find some nice, nice virgin girl, and I think he was like 40 years old at the time. He should have found some nice 19-year-old virgin aristocratic girl, pumped out an heir and a few spares, and kept the Wallis Simpson woman on the side like a normal man, right? But no, he wanted to marry her. Mm-hmm. And that automatically tells you how stupid Edward VIII was. He was a fucking idiot. Mm-hmm. Because by wanting to marry Wallis Simpson, first of all, she was a divorcee by this point. He is the leader of the Church of England. He's a defender of the faith. As the defender of the faith, it was impossible for him to marry a divorcee. It's just impossible. And do keep in mind, at this time in 1936, people were a lot more religious. Okay. Everybody was against Edward VIII. Everybody thought that he was a fucking idiot. Everybody, no exception. They all thought that he was a fool and that he was doing potentially indescribable damage to the British monarchy. Because do keep in mind, by this time, 1936, the monarchy The British monarchy was the last monarchy standing in Europe. Mhm. The Kaiser was gone. Tsar Nicholas and his family were all gone. The Habsburgs were gone. I mean, they were the last royal family left standing. And this idiot created the scandal that, had the monarchy tumbling. Okay. George V, the father of the current Queen Elizabeth, who took over in 36. See, the great advantage that he had was that he was a milquetoast man who didn't cause any waves. That's the only reason that the British royal family survived. Now, why does it matter that a British royal family survives or not? Well, because it was a linchpin of the empire. It was the political underpinning for India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa to all be part of the United Kingdom. Because these colonies were not colonies of England, they were colonies of the king. The king was, in essence, in political essence, the owner of these colonies that formed the empire altogether. Mhm. And if there's no more monarchy, if the monarchy is destroyed in scandal, as almost happened in 1936, then the political entity of the British Empire would cease to exist. There would have to be some other kind of political justification for England to rule over this vast empire. What other political justification would there be? None. So if England wanted to hold on to its empire, it would have to actually go to war and reconquer all of these colonies. Now, why, of course, does this matter? Because so many raw materials, not to mention a few goods and services, came from the colonies, from the empire, to England, to Wales, to Scotland, to Ireland. And that's how the British Isles survived. See? Because the British Isles have always needed international trade to survive ever since the Industrial Revolution started. Before the Industrial Revolution, they were more or less self-sufficient. They could be aloof from Europe. But after the Industrial Revolution, they needed their empire to supply them with the raw materials, and they needed Europe to be able to purchase all their goods and services. Winston Churchill, with his idiotic policies, created the conditions such that the Europeans, let alone the rest of the empire, had no interest in purchasing British goods and services because, due to Churchill's policies as Chancellor of the Exchequer, he had priced those goods and services out of reach. They were no longer competitive on the marketplace because of the return to the gold standard and how that had been handled. And in 1936, see, the empire that was necessary for the survival of the British Isles teetered because of the Edward VIII abdication crisis. And what did Churchill do? He sided with Edward. He actually was, banging the drum about Edward and, oh, how romantic and all this bullshit, and not understanding the reality insofar as the British Empire is concerned. You see? I mean, it seems trivial from our point of view, 85 years later. But see, at the time, this was a near catastrophe. It was as if, some famous politician in the United States started arguing that the United States should cut off all imports of all goods and services from the rest of the world. The American economy would collapse. Hmm? I mean, you have to understand the incredible bad judgment of Winston Churchill in defending Edward VIII. And on top of that, I don't know about the issue of being a bad judgment. Here it's a toss-up. He was viciously against Indian self-rule and viciously against any notion of any part of the British Empire splitting off. He wanted the empire held together by hook or by crook, okay? Which that part I'm actually in favor of. Okay, a lot of people say that was like bad judgment on his part, like being a bad colonialist. But all these colonial territories, they look back fondly on the time that they were ruled by the British Empire. So it couldn't have been that bad. And that's the truth of the matter. The only ones who are pissed off at the British are the South Africans, because do keep in mind, do you know who invented the concentration camp system in South Africa, where men, women, and children and old men were held and starved? Do you know who invented that? Do you know who invented the term concentration camp? I'll give you 3 guesses, but you're only going to need 1. And that's the truth. See, because it was Winston Churchill who came up with the idea of total war. And he implemented it first in South Africa during the Boer War. But we'll get to that in just a minute. Okay. Now, another incredibly bad judgment on his part was that he would trust people on the flimsiest of reasons, or sometimes no reason at all, and just his idea, just his random notion that had no correspondence to reality. See, during the Second World War, he completely trusted Joseph Stalin. And Joseph Stalin fucked him over a bunch of times, and completely enslaved Eastern Europe. And yet Churchill, throughout the war, he was like, oh, Joe is my buddy, buddies. He said some of the things that he said are so cringeworthy that I can't repeat them. I mean, you'd be like, hang on, I have a text here. Let me just, I didn't prepare this. I should have prepared this, but it's so, how can I put it? Wait, hang on a second. If this takes me a little bit, I'll try this one. And if I can't find it real quick, then I'll just skip it. Where is this damn thing? Okay, forget it. I can't seem to find it. But you look around at what Churchill said about Stalin, and some of it was so fucking cringeworthy. I mean, so suck up, right? Especially at Potsdam near the end of the war, when he knew the vicious nightmare that the Soviets were going to impose on Eastern Europe, and he sucked up to him. I mean, like, Jesus Christ, like a fucking $5 whore. It was just so disgusting. But yeah, terrible judgment. Now, he also had no consistency or loyalty. I mean, none whatsoever. See, Winston Churchill, because of virtue of his class, was a natural conservative, but he left the conservatives when the liberals were winning. He left them in 1904. He famously, quote unquote, crossed the aisle, because he had been elected to Parliament in 1900. But then he, in 1904, he saw that the liberals were basically winning, and he crossed the aisle. There's no other reason for it. And the conservatives despised him after that. They hated his fucking guts because they knew who he was. I mean, I'm talking about the old style conservatives, you know, the old style aristos. They knew who he was, a man of no principles whatsoever. And here's the thing, 20 years later, after he had lost his seat in 1922, and he was struggling to get back into Parliament, he again crossed the aisles and joined the Conservatives because he saw that the Conservatives were winning. It'd be one thing if he had been a Conservative and crossed the aisles to the Liberals and was a Liberal for the rest of his career. You'd be like, okay, fine, you know. But no, 20 years later, and strictly because he had lost his seat and saw the Conservatives as the winners, the upcoming winners, he changed sides. See, and what was the thing the quote I started off with? I do not care so much for the principles I advocate as for the impression which my words produce and the reputation give me. That was the man. That was the man. That's why he rejoined the Conservatives in 1924. Now, he was a virulent anti-communist, and he became even more anti-communist after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and the Civil War and the atrocities. He was perfectly aware of the communist atrocities. He was perfectly aware of the forced starvation in Ukraine in the early 1930s, the famous Holodomor. That was the forced starvation and forced industrialization that killed millions of people, millions, at least 3 million people in Ukraine. He was perfectly aware of that. He knew it, okay? It was in the fucking front pages of the New York fucking Times, okay? Pictures of people literally dying in the street in the city of Kharkov, where I live today. People were literally starving to death and falling dead in the streets of starvation. He was perfectly aware of that. He was virulently anti-communist until 1939. Until 1939, 1940 really, when all of a sudden, Stalin is like the best buddy, best friend. Mhm. He was in favor of Mussolini, the fascist Mussolini, in 1927, lauded him to his face when he visited him in 1927, because Mussolini was virulently anti-communist, anti-communist and pro-free trade, which is essentially what he was, what Churchill was. But see, you see the man, see? He doesn't believe in anything. He himself said it in that line that I quoted. And you could say, well, he said it when he was like 24 years old. Okay, fine. He said it when he was 24 years old. But in 1939, 1940, how old is he? He's 66 years old in 1940. He's 66 years old in 1940, and he's ignoring the fact that the Soviets have invaded Poland. And he's focusing all of his attention on the Germans having invaded Poland. I mean, really, see, first of all, the obvious fact, Poland is in East Europe. Germany is between the United Kingdom and Poland. It doesn't matter where the Polish parallelogram is. You can move it 200 miles east to west, as has happened over the 20th century. And the fact will always remain that between the United Kingdom and Poland sits Germany, and also France, and Holland, and Belgium, and the rest. Poland is never going to be of strategic significance to Great Britain. Never. By virtue of where it's located. As far as the British are concerned, who gives a fuck about the Poles? It's not their fucking problem. They don't mean anything. And they don't. You got to keep this in mind. You got to keep this in mind when we start talking about the Second World War. Okay, but before we get there, see, one of the things about Churchill that you'll realize is that he had an obsessive lust for war and for victory at all costs. See, why do you go to war? It's a very, very simple question. Why do you go to war? Well, because you want to win certain objectives. That's the point of it. See, if you can get those objectives without going to war, so much the better. Look at China and Taiwan right now. The Communist Party of China wants to take over Taiwan. They want it very badly. They've wanted it badly for 70 years now, 72 years. They want Taiwan badly. And there are many ways for them to do it. They can attack Taiwan and invade it. That's one way. That's war, of course. But if you're a smart leader, maybe you try to figure out another way to do it. Something that might take more time, but doesn't involve going to war. I mean, you're not afraid of going to war, but if you're going to go to war, you're going to have a clear objective. It's not, just going to send troops and see what happens and, have a lot of explosions and shit like that and body parts flying around. No, that's not the point of going to war. The point of going to war is to achieve a strategic objective. That's the point of going to war. You do not go to war just for the sake of going to war. Unless, of course, you're Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, in the First World War, wanted to go to war with Germany for no other reason than to go to war with Germany. The Germans, as a practical matter, were not really a threat to the British Empire. A lot of people have said that the Kaiser's growth of the German Navy presented a direct threat to the British Empire. That seems to me post hoc argumentation, because the fact is the Germans made no effort to fuck with the British Empire at all. And the Germans admitted to the British that they knew that their own colonies were at the whim and mercy of the British Empire, because they could not project the military power, much less a naval power, necessary to protect their overseas colonies, the German overseas colonies. The British Navy, which ruled the oceans, could roll up any German colony anywhere in the world, and the Germans didn't even have that many colonies. They were late in the game insofar as the colonial game is concerned. And so, as a practical matter, the Germans knew that their colonies were vulnerable to the British Navy, and they themselves presented no threat to the British. And yet Churchill wanted to go to war with them, and he was gleeful about it. And contemporary accounts say that he was the one who was most excited about going to war with Germany, even though nobody could actually explain what the fuck was the purpose of going to war with Germany in 1914. There is no clear reason for the British to go to war with Germany in 1914, other than the foolish balance of power doctrine that I outlined before, whereby the British would traditionally ally themselves to the weaker power on the continent so as to maintain an equilibrium. It was an outmoded way of thinking, because it was ignoring the reality that Germany, the German people, were becoming larger than the French people, and the German people, the German industry was simply stronger than the French industry, and in fact was threatening to overtake British industry. But that wasn't enough of a reason to go to war with Germany. They went to war in 1914 partly, not wholly, but one could argue determinedly, by Winston Churchill lobbying for it. As the First Lord of the Admiralty, he was desperate to go to war with the Germans. He hated the Germans, by the way. Here I have a quick sentence. Churchill, writes Andrew Roberts, quote, found Indians the beastliest people in the world next to the Germans. I mean, Churchill hated the Germans. And it's really unclear and obscure as to why he hated them so much, but he did. I mean, before the Second World War, before even the First World War, he hated the Germans. And he referred to them in racialist terms, as the German people, and he hated them. I mean, look, right there and there, he's saying that he found the Germans as beastly as the Indians, the Indians from South Asia. He hated them, and he wanted to go to war. And the Germans were the perfect example, because they were beastly people that he hated, and they were threatening his navy, even though as a practical matter, that was not true. See, so he was gleeful about going to war in 1914. But 1938, 1937, when he started this anti-appeasement talk and pushing the notion that appeasement, i.e. negotiation, was cowardly. Why was Germany expanding in the 1930s? It's very important to understand that. What was Hitler's objective? Well, it was very simple. It was the objective that Bismarck had, to unify the German people. Because you see, the German people have been spread out across all of Central Europe. The German people, the ethnic Germans, okay? They're not merely white people. There is a difference, an ethnic difference between French people and German people and Polish people. And the difference between German people and Austrian people is far less, because they really are one people. And so many people in Czechoslovakia back in 1938 were German a good third of the population. The problem was that the German people, especially in Eastern Europe, were sprinkled throughout the territory. It wasn't a neat division, okay? Like here's France, here's Germany. No, it wasn't like that. They were sprinkled throughout. And that was the great problem with Germany as a political entity. Because remember, before Bismarck, Germany had been just a series of principalities. All these little principalities were run by some trumped up little king, the Prussian king, for instance. I mean, Prussia is just a small territory, militaristic, very successful militarily speaking. But it was just another one of these little principalities, German principalities, some of them more successful than others. But they were all German speaking. And as we had the rise of the nation state, then we had this problem of all these German people sprinkled throughout the whole continent and how to bring them together. And the whole point of Adolf Hitler, he was just following along in the footsteps of Bismarck, of trying to put together the German people under one roof. This is very important because today, the Russians have the exact same problem. Because the Russians, during the Soviet Empire, they sprinkled Russians, ethnic Russians, throughout all the stands, the Kazakhstans and Azerbaijan and Armenia and Georgia and Belarus and Ukraine. They sprinkled all these Russians around, but when the Soviet Union ended and the Russian Federation came into existence, all of a sudden roughly 30 to 40 million ethnic Russians who speak Russian and who are Russian, suddenly found themselves in a foreign country. In a foreign country, be it Belarus or the Baltic states or Ukraine or as far afield as Bulgaria and Romania, in Kazakhstan, in Mongolia. I mean, spread out all over the fucking place, right? And what has Putin been doing, as he has said repeatedly in any number of interviews? He wants all the Russian people under one roof in one country, the Russian Federation, the homeland of the ethnic Russian people. Well, that's what's going on today. This has always been a problem with large nation states, with ethnic nationalities spread over a larger territory than the actual country that is under discussion. Nazi Germany was smaller than where all the ethnic Germans were. And what Adolf Hitler wanted was to agglomerate all the areas that were ethnically German under one roof. And that meant partitioning Czechoslovakia. He didn't want all of Czechoslovakia. He just wanted the German bits. Did with Alsace-Lorraine. The Anschluss, the unification of Austria to Germany, to create Greater Germany, what was the reason for that? To create a single political entity of ethnic Germans. That was the point. That's what Adolf Hitler wanted. The annexation, invasion, conquest, call it what you will, of the western half of Poland, who was living there? Germans. That's why they wanted it. You see? I mean, you got to understand what's going on here, okay? Winston Churchill understood this. But rather than try to negotiate, he called what the Nazis were doing, of bringing all the Germans under one roof, he called it appeasement. And he made it politically impossible for anyone to negotiate with the Nazis. See? Because the problem of all these ethnic Germans, and you would think that, the Nazi Germany wants to get all these Germans. Yeah, but these countries like Czechoslovakia wanted to get rid of these fucking Germans because they weren't Czech and they weren't Slovakian and they weren't Poles either. They were German. They identified as Germany. They were loyal to Germany, loyal to the Kaiser, and then loyal to Hitler. because they were German. They didn't want to be there. They didn't want to be in Poland. They didn't want to be in Czechia or Slovakia. But by making any kind of negotiation impossible, by making it toxic insofar as this notion of appeasement is concerned, he made it impossible for those ethnic Germans to become a part of Germany. Because there are two ways that those Germans could have become a part of Germany. Number one is if the territories where those Germans live becomes part of Greater Germany, Greater Nazi Germany at this time, right? We're talking in the 1930s. The other way that they could have done it is to actually physically move. Now, this would have been catastrophic because, these Germans who were living in Poland or Czechia or Slovakia or wherever, they'd been living there for centuries, millennia. I mean, there had been Frankish German tribesmen around the Baltics since at least 500 AD. You're talking about people who had been there for 1,500 years. That really is their fucking territory. Huh? But by making it impossible to unify the Germans, Winston Churchill created the conditions for an inevitable war with Germany. Because what Germans wanted was reasonable. There is a reason that Adolf Hitler was so popular with the German people. If he had been this evil dictator, I mean, do you really think that he would have been Chancellor of Germany? He was elected Chancellor of Germany in 1932, 1933? And he was very, very popular right up until the very end of the war. He was. And anybody who says differently just doesn't know what they're talking about. Adolf Hitler was extremely popular in Germany, especially before the war, because he was actually creating material prosperity for the working class people of Germany. He was actually hurting the entrenched aristocracy in Germany to the betterment of the working class people, of the proletariat, because Adolf Hitler was a socialist. He wasn't a Marxist socialist. He was a racialist socialist who wanted the betterment of his ethnic people, which is perfectly legitimate and reasonable. Of course, who wouldn't want the betterment of one's own people? And to say that that's a bad thing, what the fuck are you talking about, you fucking idiot? You want the betterment of your people. That's what Hitler wanted. And he created the conditions insofar as wages are concerned, maternity protection, obligatory vacations, that companies had to give paid vacations to the workers. He even set up seaside resorts for working class people so that they could go to the sea, to the beach, and spend a week or two by the ocean. Of course, he was popular. And of course, the Germans in Poland, in Czechia, in Slovakia, they heard about this and they wanted to be a part of that. But Winston Churchill, in his lust for power and to be back in the game, created this notion that to allow the legitimate desires of the German people was appeasement and cowardice and had to go to war over it. He created the conditions for the war. And you can say, oh, the Holocaust and all that. That was later. In fact, as I'll discuss in just a moment, you start to realize when you look into it that the reason for the Holocaust was because of Churchill. Yes, that's what happened. And I'll explain why. So anyway, in 1938 to 39, he advocated war with Germany over Poland, but not against the USSR. And this is very important. See, remember, because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviets and the Germans, the Soviets and the Nazis, both invaded Poland, and they took the eastern and western half, respectively. Great Britain declared war on Germany, not the USSR. And they declared war on Germany as the guarantor of Polish independence. That was the whole rationale. They are protecting Poland from German aggression. But wait, I don't understand here. See, if I'm protecting some country, Poland, right? See, I'm protecting against all aggressors, right? Why am I protecting it against some aggressors but not other aggressors? How come the Soviets get to invade the eastern half of Poland? And that's okay. And we're not going to go to war with the USSR over that, but we'll go to war with the Germans for taking over the western half. That doesn't make any sense now, does it? Of course not. And that shows the pernicious influence of Winston Churchill. Because there were people in the British government, in the British cabinet, who pointed this out. Well, if we're going to go to war, we ought to go to war with both of them. And he was like, no. The Germans are the problem. The Soviets, oh, they're okay. But they were doing the exact same thing. And this is long before the Nazis invaded the USSR and the British became allied in the fight against Nazis with the Soviet Union. This is long before that. This is in 1938, 1939. Well, 1939 was the invasion of Poland by the Nazis and the Soviets. Okay. In 1939, Churchill deliberately steered the conversation away and focused it exclusively on the Germans. War with Germany, not the USSR. Okay. Okay, so here comes the next problem. In September of 39, the British declared war on Germany, and that inaugurated the period of what's known as the Phony War. The Phony War was a period of approximately 6 months where everybody had declared war on one another, but nobody was actually fighting. That's basically what happened. Now, the Germans, they didn't want to go to war with the British, and they made every effort during 1939 and 1940 to assure the British that they didn't want to go to war with Britain. They didn't want to hurt the British Empire. They didn't want to destroy the British Empire. Adolf Hitler had been extremely clear, not only to his own people, but also to third-party diplomats, that he did not want to go to war with Britain because he viewed Great Britain, the British Empire, as a great force for stability. Because he saw correctly that the British Empire, by its mere presence, stopped a lot of potential conflicts in different parts of the world. In the Middle East, in Africa, in the Far East, because of the existence of the British Empire, there was a great deal of peace and stability. And if Germany were to go to war with the United Kingdom, with Great Britain, that peace and stability would be broken to the detriment of the Germans. He said this repeatedly. He said this in Mein Kampf. He wrote it there. He said that the British Empire was a great force for stability. Because remember, Adolf Hitler was an ethnic nationalist. He wanted what was best for the German people. And he recognized that whatever the fuck the British were doing insofar as their empire, it didn't affect continental Europe. It didn't affect the German people. And a lot of people say that the Nazis wanted to invade the British Isles. That's a lie. Because there was, the German military did come up with a plan to invade the British Isles, famously called Operation Sea Lion. Yeah, but every military game plans every fucking war with everybody in the world. You go to the Pentagon right now, and there is a war game, a plan, a very serious and very carefully detailed plan to invade Canada. Do you honestly think that the Americans are going to invade Canada anytime soon? I mean, fuck it. You know, you got Justin Trudeau there, and that enough might be a reason to invade the fucking country and to save those poor bastards from that fucking idiot, right? But joking aside, do you think that the Americans realistically have any intention of invading Canada? No, they don't. Do they have a plan to invade Canada? Fucking A, they do. Of course they do. Because that's what militaries do. If they're not actually fighting a fucking war, they're dreaming up a war with somebody, right? The Americans also have a plan to invade Mexico and Central America. They have a plan to invade Greenland, you know. They have a plan to invade every fucking place on the fucking earth, okay? Because that's what their job is. The German military had plans to invade the United Kingdom. The German military game played the possibility of invading North America, even though they knew as a logistic reality it would be impossible. It was just, a war game. It meant nothing. Yeah. Don't judge somebody by what they say, judge them by what they do. The Nazis had the British Army dead to sights at Dunkirk in May of 1940. When the French collapsed and the German mechanized divisions swept across the Netherlands and Belgium and just rolled up France, they cornered the British military, the British Army, 1 million men at Dunkirk. They didn't wipe them out. Why? Why would they not wipe them out? If they really wanted to invade the British Isles, what would they do? They'd bomb the fuck out of the men at the beach and then say, drop your weapons or we're just going to keep on bombing you until you're all dead. And yeah, sure, maybe 50,000 would have died and the other 900,000 or so would have said, okay, enough of this shit, and they would have thrown down their weapons and surrendered, and that would have been the British Army. And the British Army of 1 million men would have been stuck in Germany in some POW camp, and that would have been the end of any war between the United Kingdom, the British Empire rather, and Nazi Germany. Why didn't Hitler do it? Because he had no intention of going to war. He didn't want to go to war with the Brits. And he signaled to the Brits all the time. In fact, when you look at at Hitler's response and the German General Staff's response and the Foreign Ministry's response, none of them could understand why the British weren't sitting down at the negotiating table and coming to an agreement. They never understood that. And of course, they couldn't understand it because they couldn't understand Winston Churchill. Churchill wanted a war with the Germans irrespective of the cost. He didn't care about saving the British Empire. All he cared about was going to war, being a great wartime leader. And he was happy to throw away the British Empire and destroy Great Britain for the sake of winning a war that was pointless, that was unnecessary. Why did Great Britain go to war with Nazi Germany? Why? What was the point? Poland? Poland was the reason that you go to war with Nazi Germany? And you don't go to war with the Soviet Union that took the other half of Poland. What the fuck are you talking about? And Poland has zero strategic significance to the British Empire. Zero. It's not like Poland had British the oil, for instance, that the British needed, or food that the British needed. Of course not. The British Empire had Persia to get all the oil they wanted from Persia, modern day Iran. And the British had Canada for all the food supplies they could ever want. They didn't need Poland. There was no reason to go to war over Poland. And the fact that they didn't even go to war with the Soviet Union over Poland, which also invaded it, goes to show you. It was this weird German obsession of Winston Churchill. Churchill hated the Germans. And throughout his speeches, throughout his private conversations, it's clear that he had this weird, kind of like sick hatred of the Germans. And here we come to the part where he's a war criminal. Mm-hmm. You see, during the American Civil War, a lot of men on both sides, the Confederate and the Union side, died. A lot of soldiers died. Mhm. Very, very few civilians died. Extremely few. See? Because since more or less the Roman times and over the centuries, but really starting in roughly like the 1500s, warfare specifically went out of its way to avoid civilian populations. It was the unwritten rule of civilized warfare. Armies don't fuck with civilians. In the First World War, most of the battles happened around very small towns. Like, for instance, the two battles or three battles, I forget how many there were actually, at Ypres in Belgium. See, the battles actually didn't happen in the town of Ypres. Ypres is just nearby. Mhm. And that's why it gave the name to the battle. But the battle was in cow country. There was nothing there. It's just cows. See, very few civilians died. Mhm. And the same thing happened in the American Civil War. Very few civilians died. Very few atrocities committed on civilians happened. See, but the first time that that happened was the Boer War, because you see, our friend Winston Churchill came up with this notion during the Boer War that to deny the Boers food would be the way to cripple their army. And of course, if you deny the army food, you're also denying the civilians food. See? And if you want to control a population, you just grab all the civilians and throw them into concentration camps, which is what happened during the Boer War. See? It was Winston Churchill's idea to deny the Boer population food so as to break the will of the army. And of course, what happened was that the civilians and the military fought all the harder. Mhm. Because it wasn't just two armies fighting against one another. No, all of a sudden, the British Empire, at the behest of Winston Churchill, this callow 24-year-old at the time, and it's unbelievable to realize that a child of 24 convinced the British military in South Africa to do an atrocity like this, because it was an atrocity. He convinced them to deny them food. And what happened? Old men, women, and children died of starvation. And the Boer army fought all the harder because they knew it wasn't just merely a war, but it was a war to the death. And they fought with everything. And the Boers hated the British after that. It was despicable. It was truly despicable. A despicable act of a warmonger, of an evil man. Simple as that. And you can say that all is fair in love and war, but see, war had progressed to a level of civility by 1900. Armies would never harm the civilian population of their enemies. It never occurred to them. When the German army marched through Belgium, they didn't harm civilians. They had no intention of harming civilians. And then later, during the Spanish Civil War, for instance, see, a lot of people talk about Guernica. Guernica was an attack where air power, German air power, was shown to be decisive in a war. And the city of Guernica was destroyed. But the thing is, see, when you look at what happened, the Germans and Franco's forces used air power and shelled the city only when the Republican forces were in the city. They didn't preemptively destroy the city. No, it was a tactical decision. The what you call it, the forces of the Republican forces got into Guernica and hid among the civilians, and that's why the fascist forces shelled the city, but not before warning the civilians that they were going to be shelled and trying to evacuate them, because that's the way war was conducted. See, now of course the leftists after that, Picasso with painting Guernica and all that, They all said that, oh, these evil fascists, right? But why did they bomb the city? They didn't bomb it just for the hell of it. They bombed it because that's where the forces were. It was a tactical decision fighting against a specific army that was using the population as human shields. See? That's what happened. It wasn't the Germans or the Nazis or the fascists who came up with this idea of hurting the civilian population. And so far as Guernica was concerned, and other cities that became involved in the war, in the Spanish Civil War, it was just because they were being used as human shields, and the fascist forces were ruthless enough to say, "Well, okay, civilians get out of the way, but we're going to blow the fuck out of those fucking people, those fucking communists, one way or the other." You know. But anyway, the idea of total war, of hurting the civilian population, deliberately hurting the civilians in order to cause a problem for the opposing army, that tactic was invented by Winston Churchill in the Boer War. And that tactic was exacerbated in 1940 during the Second World War at Winston Churchill's command. He was the one who ordered the British Army and the British RAF to attack civilian cities to cause refugees so as to overwhelm logistically the Nazi armies. That's a little bit of history that people don't tell you, I bet. Mm-hmm. They might tell you about like the firebombing of Dresden. And that famous firebomb, you read Kurt Vonnegut's account, it's horrifying. They firebombed an entire city, a beautiful city, by the way, that had no military significance whatsoever. It's a war crime. Winston Churchill advocated for these war crimes, these crimes against humanity. He was the one who implemented total war, i.e., attacking the civilian population so as to cause problems for the opposing army logistically, to starve the people of the opposing army, because that's what he did. When he tried to, first of all, when he tried to invade Norway, and the Germans realized that that the British were going to invade Norway, so they just beat them to it. Okay, Norway was what you call it was neutral, and the Germans didn't have any interest in invading Norway. But the only reason that they did it was because the British were planning to invade it to deny coal to the Germans. Okay, and see that just goes to show you the kind of war criminal that this guy was. He was a man who would go to war with a neutral country in order to deny his enemy a source of fuel. He mined the Baltic Sea so as to deny the Germans the importation of food. He had the RAF deliberately blow up train supplies of food that were going to civilians. He firebombed cities, deliberately firebombed and gave the order to firebomb cities that had no military significance whatsoever. And the only purpose of this was to cause a refugee crisis for the Nazis. And you say that the Germans, well, they started, bombing London. Yeah, it was as a reaction to the firebombing of Berlin, the firebombing of Frankfurt, the firebombing of Cologne. The Germans basically said, well, okay, we're going to start fighting fire with fire. You fuckers are trying to kill our civilian population. Okay, we'll do the same to you, motherfuckers. And before that moment, the Nazis, even as their cities were being firebombed by the Brits, this was, of course, before the invasion of Russia and before the United States joined in the war. The Americans joined the war in December 1941. Remember the timeline. Now, what happened insofar as the Germans? They saw how the British were firebombing German cities. trying to cause humanitarian crises to break the will of the German army. And of course, just as has happened in the Boer War, the people who were attacked became even more virulent in support of the Nazi armies. Of course, because they saw it as a war of us or them. Because you got to understand, in the past, war was fought by the armies of the different countries. And the people were sort of like aloof to the wars. Mhm. And you had German soldiers going through French countryside or French soldiers going through the German countryside, and they didn't fuck with the civilian population because they're not combatants. It was Winston Churchill who changed that game, first in the Boer War, and then once he became prime minister during the Second World War in all of 1940. And all of the firebombing that he did against Germany in 1940, it was to provoke the Germans, to prevent them, to undermine the possibility of any kind of negotiated settlement. And the worst thing that Hitler did was not annihilating the British army at Dunkirk. He should have annihilated them, because he should have understood that there would be no settlement with Winston Churchill. He should have captured, bombed them and killed off maybe 50,000 British soldiers, and then captured the rest and said, look, this is my bargaining chip. You either come to the negotiating table, or these people are just going to stay in Germany forever. These 900,000 British soldiers, we'll just hold them. We can hold them. Okay, it's easy to hold a soldier. To hold 50 soldiers, you only need 2 with machine guns. It's as simple as that. That's the basic math of it. Okay, you set up a concentration camp. I'm not talking about a death camp like in the Holocaust. I'm talking about a prison camp, right? You set up a prison camp for POWs, unarmed, of course, and you set it up with roughly 2 men manning machine guns for every 50 to 100 soldiers. 50 to 100 POWs. They aren't going anywhere. And you don't have to feed them very well. You can give them 1,000 calories, 1,500 calories each per day, and that'll be plenty. They'll survive. If they're fit, healthy men, of course they'll survive. And they'll just be sitting there for months, years, at relatively minimal expense to the state that has these POWs. That's what Hitler should have done. See, that was the great mistake, because I insist, he didn't understand that Winston Churchill was a warmonger, a man of no morals, willing to harm and kill and burn alive civilians for the sake of maintaining the war. You got to understand what was going on. Okay, I mean, it's something that people don't seem to understand about Churchill. And the more you read about it, the more obvious it is. He was a warmonger who loved war and wrote a lot of propaganda after the war justifying himself and pretending that he had been noble. He hadn't been noble. He was a despicable piece of shit. And if there is a hell, he's burning merrily there in one of the inner circles of hell. Hopefully the devil himself has a pitchfork up his ass, because he was an evil man. Simple as that. And then after the war at Potsdam, see, when the war was winding down, after the British had expended all their treasury and all of their empire to finance this war, this pointless war, see? And after the British had so crippled the ability of the Germans to have food for their own people, it was only then that the Germans decided that they had to wipe out the Jews and Polish Catholics. Do you know why? Food. See, because the British had so gone out of their way to target German civilian population that the British Ministry of War realized that they were not going to have enough food to feed the army and people and all the prisoners that they had. Because they had all these Russian prisoners, I mean, over 1 million of them, and all these ethnic Jews that they wanted to get rid of, not get rid of like kill them, just get rid of them. They wanted them out of Europe. And they were thinking of either shoving them into the lap of the Russians or shoving them into Ukraine. That was the prevailing sentiment. But of course, moving, 4 million Jews, it's not an easy task. Mhm. And then you had all these Polish Catholics who were dissidents, who were essentially a guerrilla army waiting for the chance to fight against the Nazis, right? A lot of them Polish communists and whatnot. And so the Germans altogether had something like 6 million prisoners. That was roughly how many they had, between about 4 million Jews, about a million Polish Catholics, and a million assorted others, gypsies and all kinds of other people, undesirables for whatever reason. And they realized that they didn't have the food to feed them. And so the Germans, being very German, very practical, sometimes without realizing what they were doing, they figured, well, we got all these people, and at the Wannsee conference at the suburb in Berlin called Wannsee, and that was recorded as the Wannsee Protocol, they came up with the final solution. And the final solution was not like the final solution of just kill them all. No, it was more sophisticated than that. It was the creation of two kinds of camps: death camps and work camps. The death camps were basically going to be places where people were held and not fed. And they were just useless because they were too old or too young or too infirm, and they'd just be held until they were dead. And if some of them had to be killed with gas, fine. But the real issue was going to be cremating them and getting rid of all the bodies. But these people were just not going to be fed, period. They were just going to starve to death. What happened to Anne Frank? That's basically that. She was too infirm. And so the Germans decided we can't feed them, because we can't feed our army and we can't feed our people and feed all these prisoners that we have. And between our people and these prisoners, well, sorry, our people matter to us more than fucking Jews and gypsies and Polish Catholics who want to kill us. Fuck them. And that's what they did. And the other part, of course, was there was the death camps that were basically starved to death. It wasn't so much that they were actively executed. Some of them were, but for the most part, they were starved to death. The other thing were work camps, where every able-bodied Jew or gypsy or Polish Catholic was forced to work. The movie Schindler's List, that's an example of a work camp. All those people who were working for Schindler, they were healthy enough to work. Okay, that camp, that was a work camp. See, it was very different from a death camp. Mm-hmm. Death camp were just held and starved to death. And they were held because you had to hold them somewhere. And you had to discriminate between the people you were going to save, i.e. ethnic Germans, and of course the German army to keep on fighting the war, and those people who were just, you're not going to feed them. So you have to hold them somewhere so they don't potentially steal the food from the German people that you are going to save. See? Now, this decision of the Nazis, why was it precipitated? Why? Because Winston Churchill carried out a policy of total war, of denying Germans food. That's the reason for it. His decision directly led to the Germans having to make the very cold-blooded, hard-headed, hard-hearted decision that, in our priority insofar as feeding people, it's number one, the German army, because we need them fighting. Number two, the German people, because they're our people. And number three, all these undesirables that mean nothing to us. They die. That was the math of it. And it's ugly, it's awful, sure. But why was the decision precipitated? Because of Winston Churchill. And that's not all. See, when the Allies partitioned Europe at Potsdam, and also previously in Tehran and in Yalta, see, Winston Churchill deliberately allowed Joseph Stalin to take over Eastern Europe. And he deliberately allowed the policy of ethnic cleansing of Germans. In fact, he made it a point. He wanted the Germans to be removed from Eastern Europe. The whole reason for Nazi expansionism was to bring all the German people under one roof. As I explained before, they were spread out over Poland, over Czechia, over Slovakia, and the rest of it, right? And some in Romania and all of it. They were all over the fucking place, right? The Churchill deliberately gave the go-ahead for the ethnic cleansing of Germans from East Prussia, which was given over to the Soviets and became Kaliningrad, right? Even though that sliver of territory, East Prussia, had been German for 1700 years. No, they were wiped out. All the Germans were stripped of that. They moved 11 million Germans. They were forcibly removed. And of those 11 million, 2 million died. And that's a fact. And that was a direct result of Churchill's decisions. The Soviet army had a policy of forcible rape. They raped every, what was the statistic I read? It was 50% of women between the ages of 13 and deceased. 50% of the women in Eastern Europe, in the territories that the Soviet army captured, they were raped, forcibly raped. In fact, it was the reason that Alexander Solzhenitsyn, went to the Gulag. He found it despicable. He found it despicable that the NKVD, in direct orders from Stalin by way of Laurent Beria, ordered the enlisted men to rape German women and to have a running count. He found that despicable. And he said so in a letter, that he found it the most disgusting thing ever, immoral, that it was against God and every principle. And that's the reason he went to the Gulag, by the way. Okay? And Churchill knew that this was the policy of these fucking communist animals. He knew it. He knew who they were. He'd known for decades who they were. And yet he allied himself and the British Empire to the Soviets and allowed them, encouraged them to do what they did. Huh? It's really just mind-boggling, the evil of this man Churchill, because he really was an evil man. And don't give me any bullshit that, pretty words and speeches, and he was so inspiring. Fuck that. Fuck that. The man was an evil bastard. He targeted civilians. He created the conditions for the Holocaust. He created the conditions for the forced displacement of 11 million Germans, 2 million of whom died. And nobody talks about that. Of course not. Huh? That was all swept under the rug. It was all because of Churchill. He was an evil man. And anybody who says differently, I'll just fucking boot the fuck out of you. I don't want to hear it, because I've read enough, I know enough, and I'm telling you how it is. Now, finally, we come to the crucial question, the crucial question, which is, did Churchill protect and expand his nation? See, ultimately, you can be a great wartime leader, a great this, a great that, but it doesn't really matter unless you can answer this final question. Did he protect and expand his nation? You look at Genghis Khan, Temujin, of the Mongol Empire, the founder of the Mongol Empire. Did he protect his people? Oh, yeah. Did he expand his nation? Oh, the fuck yeah. Yeah. The Mongol Empire, the Mongols were these grassland people, fucking butt-fuck nowhere. And by the time Temujin died, at age, I forget when he died, but in his lifetime, he had conquered all of Asia. His grandchild, Kublai Khan, conquered China and established the Forbidden City. Do you know why it's called the Forbidden City? because it's where the Mongols decided to leave only grassland so that their horses could graze unobstructed. They leveled, there were like a bunch of buildings there originally, and the Mongols leveled them and just turned it all into grassland in the middle of the fucking city. So that their horses, their ponies, could graze around and they could live in their tents, because that's what the fucking Mongols like. They didn't like city life. They hated cities. In fact, they would say, surrender or we're going to annihilate your city. And if you didn't surrender, they annihilate your city, they'd level it, burn it to the fucking ground, and turn your whole fucking city into grassland. Okay? In Beijing, it's called a forbidden city because it was forbidden to all except Mongols, ethnic Mongols. And only ethnic Mongols could go there and bring their horses and let them graze around in this park in the middle of the capital of the Chinese Empire, which they had captured and conquered. It was only after the Mongols had become completely assimilated in the Yuan dynasty and so forth that they started rebuilding in the middle of the Forbidden City and so on and so forth. And the Forbidden City now is like a city within the city. But originally, that's what the Mongols did. Was Timuchin a great leader? Fuck yeah. Was he a great warlord? Fuck yeah, he was. Was Julius Caesar a great warlord? Fuck yeah. Went and beat the shit out of the Gauls, took over the whole fucking thing, beat Pompey. He was all kinds of tough. He was a real warlord. He really delivered. Yes, he fucking did. Was FDR a great warlord? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Because he had other armies fight his enemies, and then he came in at the end and took the spoils. And he made America great. Yeah, he really did. Okay? He turned the United States into a global empire. He fought a two-front war against two of the toughest empires on the planet. And he was smart enough to let the Soviets throw all their soldiers at the Nazis and let the Chinese throw all their soldiers at the Japanese. And he came in the end and swooped it all up and got all the prizes. See? That's a great warlord. I mean, I despise FDR, but he was a fucking warlord. He knew what the fuck he was doing. He understood that a war is not about winning the fucking war. Who gives a shit? It's about winning the peace. It's about getting the strategic prizes at the end. But Winston Churchill, he cared about winning the wars, no matter the cost. In 1924, his policies directly led to the Great Depression in the UK. In 1940, he went to war against the Nazis for no compelling reason. There was no reason to go to war with the Nazis. None whatsoever. There wasn't. Not for the British Empire. It was pointless. He went to war in 1940 at his instigation. In 1914 to 1956, because of Churchill's direct involvement and advocacy, the greatest empire on the planet became a third-tier nation with a broken economy and a broken spirit. That's a fact. He was there between 1914 and 1956 at all the key moments. And why am I mentioning 1956? That was the Suez Canal crisis. That's when the British realized, holy shit, we're nobodies. We're over. It was a self-conscious, come to Jesus moment when they realized it was over. The British Empire is over. When people talk about the British Empire today, it's like a joke, It's oh so quaint. It's the British Empire. Oh, and the Queen. Oh, that's so cute. Back in 1914, the British Empire was not to be fucked with. It was literally the empire on which the sun did not set. By 1956, barely 42 years later, it was nothing. It was laughable. A laughable little country that couldn't even hold up against the fucking Egyptians, a key canal for trade that they needed for their survival. They didn't have the power to hold it. Yeah. And between those In those 42 years, every single major decision was because of Winston Churchill. And every single decision he made or pushed for or advocated was the wrong one. Every fucking time. He batted 1,000. That's what he fucking did. And look at the population of Great Britain, the British Isles, okay? Not the British Empire, just the British Isles. In 1914, the British Isles had 46 million people. And in 1945, it only had 47 million people. In 30 years, they only grew by less than 2%. In 30 years. The GDP of Britain in 1914 was 42 million pounds, 42 billion pounds. And by 1945, it was 48 billion pounds, 47.9 billion pounds. What's that? 15% in 31 years. That's what Winston Churchill did. Quite apart from his crimes against humanity for the implementation of total war, quite apart from him almost deliberately, almost consciously condemning half of Europe to enslavement to the Soviet Empire for 50 years. Quite apart from the fact that, see, everybody knew that in World War II, the Germans, the Nazis, and the Soviets were going to go to war. And the smart people, they all said the same thing. Let them kill each other. The Nazis will probably win, and the Nazis have no interest whatsoever in the British Empire. They had made it clear over and over and over again. They had no interest whatsoever in harming the British Empire because they saw it as a force for stability worldwide. The stability that the British Empire provided was an umbrella that the Nazis recognized and understood would help them insofar as trade, would help them insofar as feeding their own people. To fuck with the British Empire went against the best interests of the Nazis. They had no interest in it. They never had. And again, I have to insist, these stupid fucking imbeciles who say that, the Germans wanted to invade England. There's a movie called The Remains of the Day. It's a very good movie. But at one point, it takes place in a country house in England. And before the war, this German delegation goes to this house. And in the movie, they say how the German delegation is already saying oh, this is a beautiful house. It'll be lovely when we take it over. Like the Germans had this intention of invading England. That's absurd. They never had any intention. And any kind of Wehrmacht war game, the famous Operation Sea Lion, it meant nothing. Because did the Germans actually ever do anything to invade the UK? Nothing, ever. It was all bullshit. This notion that, the British fought the Nazis to protect the world from the evil of the Nazis, that is a lie. Because the Germans had no interest, the Nazis had no interest in people foreign to themselves. And do you know how I can prove this? And it's very easy to prove, but do you know how I can prove this? How they treated France after they defeated France. What did the Germans do? When they invaded France, they took Paris. Hitler fucking went to Paris and took some pictures in front of the Eiffel Tower and Napoleon's tomb. I mean, that fucking country was fucking conquered by the Nazis. They conquered the fuck out of it. And what did the Germans do? They occupied Paris. The German army, yes, they had soldiers stationed in Paris, but they gave over the administration of the country to the Vichy government. The Vichy government was French. They weren't Germans. Not a one was in there. And the administration of the country, of France, was given over to the Germans. Did the Germans take over the French Navy? They captured it whole in May of 1940 when they captured the whole country, right? The Germans had control of the French Navy. And what did the Germans do? The Nazis. What did they do with the French Navy? Did they deploy them? No, they parked them in Marseille. And the British, Churchill, decided that they had to be destroyed, okay? Because they presented a weapon, a potential offensive weapon to the Nazis. This was in 1940. But the Nazis had the fucking ships, all these battleships, and they could crew them and run them. Sure, no problem. See? I mean, they had the manpower to do it, but they didn't. They didn't put the French Navy that they had captured, they didn't put it out to sea. That French Navy was 1.5 times larger than in terms of gross tonnage, than the German Navy at the time. If the Nazis wanted to invade England at some point, wouldn't it have been smart for them to take the French Navy, man it with Nazi troops, get them up to snuff, train them, because you got to train your sailors to operate equipment and to get ready for some invasion of England? Wouldn't they have done that? Why did they just simply mothball them in fucking Marseille? What was the point of that? Well, because the Nazis didn't give a fuck about the Navy, because they had no intention of using it, because they didn't care. Because what they cared about was Germany and German people, ethnic Germans. They didn't give a fuck about the Brits or the French for that matter. They didn't care about conquering France. They conquered it. And what did they do? They turned it around and gave it to the Vichy government, which was loyal to the Nazis in the sense that the Vichy government wasn't going to go to war with the Nazis, right? And what did the Nazis do with the French soldiers? They demobilized them and sent them back to fucking France. That's what they fucking did. Does that sound to you like a regime that wants to take over the world? No, because they didn't want to take over the world. They wanted to look after their own fucking people. But Winston Churchill convinced the world that it was a fight for humanity, or some bullshit like that. He was such a sick warmonger that he viewed a very clear problem of ethnic nationalism, of wanting to politically unify your own people. He viewed that as an excuse to go to war, total war against civilians, starving civilians, firebombing civilians, destroying his own nation, destroying the British Empire, all for his ego. That's the truth about Winston Churchill. That's the truth about Winston Churchill. He was an evil man. And that is the end of my presentation. Yeah. So there you go. That's the story. Look, guys, I've been going for like 2.25 hours, and so I'm going to skip the Q&A because I'm a little bit burned out. Okay, because I'm over my cold, but I'm still kind of exhausted. Yeah, it was horrible. This whole situation is horrible. Okay, in 1914, Europe committed suicide. The flower of Europe, something like 3-4 million soldiers, young men in the prime of youth, their lives are thrown away for nothing, for no reason whatsoever. And then you have the Second World War. Countless millions were killed, Russians, Germans. It broke the continent. It broke it. And this man, Churchill, he was instrumental in both wars. And I have to insist, I have to go back to the simple issue. There was no reason to go to war. There was absolutely no fucking reason, I mean, if you buy the propaganda that it was like to save civilization, see, well, you're just buying into the bullshit narrative, okay? Because it's a lie. See, the Germans, the Nazis, they wanted to look after their own people. That's what they wanted. Mhm. And Winston Churchill was this evil man who wanted to go to war with somebody for his own aggrandizement. It's as simple as that. Huh? Was Hitler like a good guy? No, it was a ruthless son of a bitch. They all were. To be the leader, to be the guy who's running shit, you're not a nice guy, okay? You can't be, irrespective of whether you're successful or not, okay? Like Timuchin, that is Genghis Khan, or FDR, or Julius Caesar, they're all bastards, but they succeeded. They protected their people, made their nation stronger. When they went to war, they minimized the deaths of their own people and maximized the deaths of their enemies. And they did whatever was necessary, not to win, but to succeed. It's so important. But Winston Churchill cared about winning wars and aggrandizing himself. Yeah. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I'm going to wind it down. Give me a grade if you want to. I'll wait around for you guys to tell me, give me a grade from A to F. What do you think? What did you think of this presentation? And I would urge you, as I wait for my grades to come in because of the delay, I would urge you to read Patrick Buchanan's book, The Unnecessary War. I'm going to put it right there. You go. This book. This is absolutely the best book that you can read about this particular topic. Okay? I highly recommend it. Here's the title once again, the spine of it, so you can see it. Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War. And the subtitle is How Britain Lost Its Empire and the West Lost the World. Okay? By Patrick Buchanan. It was published in 2008, I believe. It is a fantastic book. Okay? And so, yeah. Sorry, I'm not taking questions today. I'm just like, I'm beat, man. Talking for 2 hours, even about something that you're passionate about and you know about, it's exhausting. So that's why, unfortunately, I'm not going to be taking any questions. But I will be taking questions on Sunday. Hopefully, I'll be in better shape by then. So until then, thank you so much for listening, and I will catch